may be able to do differently to try and better achieve that. And so those are the things that I may be describing that are a little bit different. But my intent is not to change the target that we've been managing towards. So just like the philosophy with this is similar to that with license simplification, trying to increase the value for our internal customers this time, our biologists, give them something a little bit more concrete and focused that they can manage towards, and also our external customers, commission, cabs, and the public. As I mentioned, I am not trying to change the objectives. We can change them. That may be something that comes out of this process, but if we do, it's going to follow the process. It's not going to be, I'm not going to say let's manage for $20 per 100 doses. That's not going to be what my intent. But we may change, the big points, we may change how we measure those objectives. So here's some examples. The mule deer, currently our buck-to-doe ratio is 30 to 100. It's measured in the fall after the hunt. We data that we collect during appropriate survey periods, and we're capable of developing confidence intervals. We're not proposing any change to that criteria. The challenge we have is trying to get the data during the appropriate survey period in all areas. We're limited by time, and we've got to conduct these surveys during the run to get the most representative samples. And so it's a process challenge. It's not really relevant to the guidelines itself. We may, and we are investigating adaptations to survey, but that's a biological issue. That's the science that the department does. It's not a guideline change. Antlerless harvests are another example. Our rationale currently is fairly obscure, and oftentimes we've done a bad job of being able to explain why we do it. And so what we've tried to do with this initial draft is trying to define population size and the conditions under which the agency will recommend antlerless harvest. That isn't something that's really well articulated currently, so that's going to be a little bit different moving forward into the future. And again, this is just like with any of the previous conversations. Feel free to stop me and ask questions as we go through this. Probably the biggest change that I would say that we've got in this draft currently is the recommendation on elk. We currently have a bull-to-cow ratio that we manage towards, or we say we manage towards. However, we don't measure it at a time of year when we can accurately measure that. We survey during the winter months. To be able to accurately estimate the bull-to-cow ratio, it has to be done during the rut. And there's a variety of reasons we don't do that, not the least of which is we can't even realistically attain the bull-to-cow ratios that we've got within our management plans. It indicates that it will be down around 40. In most of our units, we're probably in excess of 70. And that's a challenge to reduce that bull-to-cow ratio because most of those units, we have population caps, and we're harvesting cows at a pretty significant rate to keep that population from growing. If you're leaning on the cow segment of the population, you're going to have more bulls starting to stack up. And so what we're recommending that we move to here is to look at main beam length. I think I've got that, yes. And so there are alternative ways to get at the same objective. And what we're doing is looking at what we've already got. And I've spoke about this, especially with things like mountain lions and black bears in the past. There are several different ways, at least two fundamentally different ways of looking at harvest rates and the degree of exploitation you may have. You can look at characteristics that you measure on a population. You can look at population size, you can look at recruitment rates, a variety of things like that. You can also look at harvest characteristics. So if we're looking at the harvest characteristics, what does an appropriately exploited population, what are the characteristics of that harvest? And so what we're proposing is looking at mean beam length. And so this is a graph of what our current harvest looks like with mean beam length in one particular unit, on weight 131, 132. And what you see is that age, mean beam length peaks somewhere between, right around 7 to 8 years of age. And so what we would propose in this situation is that we start managing for, we already have people reporting what the mean beam length was. We have 98% compliance on people reporting mean beam length. So we've got good data on it. And so for standard units, places where we already harvest bulls, what we would see, what we do see now is 25 to 35% of the harvest has got 50 inch or greater mean beam length. If we continue to monitor that, if we see that start to increase, we have the ability, that means there's more bulls out there, and we can increase the tag that we offer. On the other hand, if we start to see a decrease, then we can choose to be more restrictive, more conservative, and we will see that age class start to comprise a larger proportion of the population. It's independent of the ratio, but it is not independent of the number of bulls or the age structure of the bulls that are on the landscape.
Brian, I just was wondering, could there be other factors that contribute to a change in beam length, though?
Absolutely. And things that influence mean beam length include, how, forage quality, forage availability during the growth period. And so what we're proposing is not using a single year's worth of data, but using 3-year averages. That's something that we commonly use to try and level out those fluctuations. You're absolutely right, there are other things that influence. But you don't see the influence on elk antler growth at the same rate of what you do on, say, mule deer antler growth. It's influenced to a far greater degree. Some other changes. Currently, we have a guideline in place on buck-to-doe ratios for pronghorn. In most cases, we are substantially above that. But if we focus on 2-year-old bucks and greater, it fits right into our guideline. And so again, what we're proposing is a change to include only 2-year-old buck-to-doe ratio. So, right now our guideline is 20 to 30 bucks per 100 does. In most cases, we're well over that, but if we only consider bucks that are 2 years old and older, that would bring us right within that guideline. Also, if you look at these critters, their horn growth differs from deer and elk. They attain maximum growth much earlier in their life, and so it's less relevant to try and keep an older age class population. At this point, we don't. We're also going to specify doe hunt objectives in here. Coming to bears, at this point in time, we're not recommending any change to what the guidelines, the existing guidelines have for the bear structure. And what we really wanted to have that conversation with the public and try and figure out whether or not the commission feels that the current guidelines as outlined in the bear management plan, not in the bear report, but the bear management plan, are appropriate or not. Bighorn sheep, looking at ewe hunt objectives, in most cases what we're seeing is that we've done a lot of antlerless or female harvest that provides opportunities for people to get in the field, but we don't really define when and where we want to do that very well. Another thing that we haven't really defined, and if you go through the units, you'll see some units have got higher bull-to-cow ratios or higher buck-to-doe ratios. We're not recommending any changes to those units. We're just recommending that we recognize them as alternative units. places where you have the chance of harvesting an older age class animal. And so we try to identify the units that are currently there. The other thing throughout, and this will be a change, is something that's going to require some discussion, are standardizing season dates. We're recognizing that there will be regional differences and that there are good reasons and good rationales to have differences in start and ending dates, but to the extent possible, we want to standardize those and provide the hunting public with the ability to look at those and have a better ability to say, my deer hunt's going to start on this date regardless of what unit I've been drawn for.
So if I could just clarify that a little bit, I know there's been some concern over standardized dates, and I just want to expound on that. What Brian's talking about is that it's not one start date for all deer season. It's a suite of, instead of having one late season in the eastern region start on November 11th and a late season start on November 10th in the western region, there would be a standardized late season mule deer start date where they would all start on November 10th, but there would be the early season on whatever, October 5th, but it would be standardized so we weren't going to have 3 different days where the late mule deer hunt started.
And you'll see that there still is some regional differences, but within that region, we try to simplify it and have it start on their standard date. So, and we're still retaining split seasons, trying to just get things as close to similarity as what we reasonably can expect. Currently, what we're recommending on mountain lions is that we would have a statewide objective. It wouldn't be on a area by area or region by region. However, we do want to monitor. There have been papers published, and we've been criticized because we haven't used that data to be able to identify population structure, genetic population structure. And so what we want to do is look at each one of those and monitor the harvest characteristics within those to indicate whether or not those groups of units are being overexploited. If they are being overexploited, we can come back and have a subsequent harvest objective that's specific to those units. Currently, our assessment, even looking at it in that framework, we're not seeing any evidence of overexploitation currently. Mountain goats, we're not recommending any changes. Upland game and fur bearers, no substantive changes within that. We do want to clarify the management objectives that we're planning to use for bobcats. That was the framework that Mr. Wilson basically shared with the commission in June when he gave his recommendation on trapping seasons. Now, we will be seeking some public input on these guidelines. These will be placed on the website. We do have 5 public meetings scheduled. This is where they're located and the dates that we're planning. We plan to come back to the commission in September, share the input we received, share any additional revisions to the guidelines, and certainly solicit input from the commission at that point. And then we plan to come back with a final set of recommendations in November. If the commission chooses to adopt them in November, we would then plan to implement those seasons in January and use those to adjust quotas in April. Any other questions anybody might have on what we're proposing here? Mr. Drew.
So if we could go back one slide, Brian.
You got it.
And again, it gets back, so briefing the commission with public feedback in September. That's what feedback from the workshops.
Feedback from the workshops, and we would also solicit feedback from the commission.
Okay, so
We would share the feedback we've received, and then we would solicit feedback from the commission.
So soliciting feedback from the commission would include both of these documents being posted online as support material, so that the county advisory boards and the public all have time to review those prior to the meeting, as well as the commissioners?
Absolutely.
What's
They
the-
should have following this meeting as well.
Okay, and I appreciate, and I know we talked about this a lot, the last time we got an update, having some sort of mechanism to see what we're doing now versus kind of what the proposed revisions would be, and I like the two separate documents. Just quickly looking through there, there's two suggestions I would make that would help me immensely in kind of formulating all this in my mind. And one would be to actually highlight the proposed changes in the initial revised draft. So, the yellow highlighting or boldface or whatever the case may be, because as I thumb through this, I mean, it's gonna be pretty hard, even though they're side by side, to know what the actual changes are. And I'm tracking this as you're talking. So I think that would help everyone. And then maybe for each species, right at the top of the section, cite what the background source is for each species. So if essentially what we're doing now is prescribed for bighorn sheep out of the bighorn sheep management plan, I think it would be good for people to know that. Mule deer, same thing. You mentioned with black bear, that's specific to NDOW's management plan, not specific to the commission committee recommendations. So I think just knowing what the background source is for each one of those species would be very helpful, as well as the highlights of whatever revisions are being proposed.
I will try and get through and highlight the proposed changes before we post these. And in most cases, I think we've referenced the plans in the beginning. I may have missed some, but if you look, for instance, in the beginning of the elk plan, or the elk section, it lists all the plan and all the sub-plans that go underneath it. The pronghorn plan is referenced. I can't remember whether or not we've done that on the bear or not, but I'll ensure that we do.
Yeah, and I guess even, like maybe on some of the fur bear, if there's not for even bobcat, it just says the department's bobcat management objective. If there's not an adopted plan, it would be good to know that.
Very good.
Any further questions for Brian? And then we'll close out. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. I've got